All right, so today we're going to try to understand the League of Nations.
Okay.
Not just the surface level stuff, but the real nitty gritty, why it mattered and why it ultimately crumbled.
Right. Yeah.
We're going deep on this one, folks,
Mm.
with an episode of American History Hit with historian Charlie Lauderman.
It's a good one.
Yeah, so to set the scene, it's 1919.
Right.
The world is picking up the pieces after, World War I, this devastating conflict.
Yeah.
And you've got these leaders gathering in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles,
Mhm.
hoping to forge a path towards peace, lasting peace.
Right.
But of course, it wasn't that simple.
No, never is.
You've got Woodrow Wilson, right, arriving with his grand vision for this League of Nations.
Yeah.
And then you've got Clemenceau of France, who understandably wants to make sure that Germany can't pose a threat again.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's not forget about British Prime Minister Lloyd George,
Right.
who actually quipped that negotiating between Wilson and Clemenceau
Yeah.
felt like being stuck between Jesus and Napoleon.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good.
That's got to be one for the history books.
It really captures the intensity
Mm.
of, those negotiations and just the weight of everything that was being decided.
Absolutely. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to understand why the League was created,
Okay.
how it actually tried to prevent future wars,
Right.
and what ultimately led to its downfall.
The big questions.
The big questions. But before we get into the League itself, let's rewind a bit for some context.
Okay. So I think it's important to remember that the 19th century saw this rise of these nation states,
Mhm.
each fiercely protective of their borders
Yeah.
and fueled by this, surge of nationalism.
Yeah.
And this new world order, right, while seemingly organized, was actually a breeding ground for competition and conflict.
And World War I, that was just like the brutal wake-up call.
Yeah.
Showing just how destructive this, kind of intense nationalism could be.
Yeah, for sure.
But the League wasn't the first attempt at getting nations to play nice, was it?
No, not at all. You had things like the Concert of Europe, which was formed after the Napoleonic Wars.
Right.
And it was an early, albeit flawed, attempt at international cooperation.
Yeah.
The aim there was to maintain a balance of power in Europe
Mm-hmm.
and prevent any one country from dominating.
So the idea of, this international cooperation was already floating around.
Yeah.
Even before the horrors of World War I.
Yeah, definitely. It was there.
Okay, so let's talk about Woodrow Wilson then.
Okay.
The man who's practically synonymous with the League of Nations.
Yeah, he's really the face of it.
Yeah.
And he was, Wilson's a fascinating figure. He was driven by this idea of making the world safe for democracy,
Right.
which on the surface seems like a noble goal.
Yeah.
But I think his motivations were actually a lot more complex,
Right.
blending this idealism with, a dose of political pragmatism.
Interesting. So it wasn't just purely about this vision of peace.
Right. It was more nuanced than that.
Well, and even Teddy Roosevelt back in 1910, when he accepted the Nobel Prize,
Yeah.
had advocated for a League of Peace.
Interesting.
I love this quote. He said, "It would be a master stroke if those great powers honestly bent on peace would form a League of Peace not only to keep the peace among themselves, but to prevent it from being broken by others."
Wow, what foresight.
Right.
So interesting that he would say that, given his reputation
Totally.
for big stick diplomacy.
Yeah.
But he was a pragmatist,
Oh.
and he recognized the growing dangers
Yeah.
of international tensions.
Okay, but back to Wilson.
Okay.
He lays out his vision right in his famous 14 points.
Right. The 14 points.
Yeah. What were they all about?
So the 14 points were this blueprint, for a more peaceful world.
Yeah.
And they were actually quite groundbreaking for the time.
Really? In what way?
Well, Wilson called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade,
Mm-hmm.
and, of course, the creation of a League of Nations to help maintain peace.
Yeah. So it sounds like he was coming to Versailles with a pretty radical agenda.
Yeah, he was definitely shaking things up.
How did other world leaders react to him and his grand plan?
Well, there was a mix of, hope and skepticism.
I can imagine.
Clemenceau, as we mentioned, was wary of Wilson's idealism,
Yeah.
and he actually famously quipped about the 14 points. He said something like, well, the Lord Almighty had 10 commandments, and Wilson's got 14 points.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Right.
It's clearly not totally on board.
A little bit of skepticism there.
Yeah, but what about the British? Where did they stand?
Well, the British under Lloyd George saw the League as a way to secure this vital alliance with the United States.
Okay.
They were less interested in, Wilson's idealism and more focused on the strategic benefits of a partnership.
So even from the start, it's as much about power dynamics as it is about peace.
Right, you can't separate those two.
It's all intertwined.
That's the reality of international relations.
Was that always kind of the tension at the heart of it?
Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah, real politics.
Real politics.
Politics based on practical considerations rather than moral principles was always at play.
Okay.
But the core principle of the League was this idea of collective security,
Okay. What does that mean?
meaning that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all.
So like a united front
Right.
against any aggressor.
Yeah.
Okay, in theory, that sounds pretty powerful.
Right. It does.
But then you have the Armenian crisis.
Yeah.
This horrifying event that really puts those principles to the test.
A real tragedy.
So the Armenian genocide happening right in the middle of this whole debate about the League of Nations
Right.
becomes a focal point in these discussions about the League's role
Yeah.
and its ability to protect vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. It's a major test.
And Wilson actually supported the idea of the U.S. taking on a mandate over Armenia,
He did.
seeing it as a chance to, demonstrate global leadership and put those principles into action.
Yeah, he saw it as an opportunity.
Interesting. But that actually kind of backfired, didn't it?
It did in a way because this potential mandate, became a weapon that opponents of the League in the U.S. used.
Interesting.
They argued that this was proof that the League would drag the U.S. into unwanted conflicts,
Okay.
further fueling that isolationist sentiment.
So even a humanitarian intervention, right, a move meant to help,
Yeah,
is twisted into an argument against international involvement.
it's a complex situation.
Yeah, it seems like the seeds of the League's failure were already being sown right there.
I think you're right to truly understand why the League ultimately collapsed.
Yeah.
We need to turn our attention to the political battle brewing back in the U.S.,
Okay.
a battle that would really determine the fate of the League and reshape the course of history.
All right, let's do it. So the Armenian crisis really highlights these complexities and the challenges, that the League faced from the get-go.
It does.
But it was that political battle back in the U.S. that really sealed the League's fate.
Right. The U.S. Senate became this battleground over the Treaty of Versailles. You had Wilson facing off against Senator Henry Cabot Lodge.
Right, Lodge, a staunch opponent of the League.
Yeah, a powerful figure.
And it really all came down to one specific part of the treaty, didn't it? Article 10.
Exactly. Article 10 was the heart of this collective security idea.
Okay.
It stated that an attack on one member of the League would be considered an attack on all of League,
Okay.
requiring a collective response.
Right.
And so Lodge and other opponents, they saw this as a direct threat to U.S. sovereignty.
Yeah.
They were arguing that it would drag the country into foreign wars without the consent of Congress.
So they're concerned about being pulled into conflicts that weren't in the U.S.'s direct interest.
Exactly.
I can see how that argument would resonate with a lot of people, especially after the horrors of World War I.
Oh, absolutely. People were weary of war.
Yeah.
And Wilson, in his typical, unwavering fashion, refused to compromise on Article 10.
Oh, wow.
He believed so strongly in League and its potential to prevent another global war that he just wasn't willing to budge.
It sounds like that stubbornness might have backfired, though.
It did, in a way, because his health was declining.
Yeah.
And he ended up having a stroke, during her speaking tour, trying to rally support for the treaty.
What a twist of fate.
It was a tragic turn of events.
So this inability or unwillingness to compromise,
Yeah.
coupled with his declining health, ultimately led to the treaty's defeat in the Senate.
Right. And with that, the U.S., the country that had championed the idea of the League, rejected it.
I mean, it's almost an incredible irony that the very nation that birthed the League of Nations ended up being its downfall.
It's one of those pivotal moments in history where you can't help but wonder, what if?
What if?
What if Wilson had been more willing to compromise?
Yeah.
What if the U.S. had joined the League?
Right.
Would the course of history have been different?
A question that historians still debate today.
They do.
Okay, so we've talked about Wilson and then Lodge, these key players.
Right.
But what about other figures who shaped this debate surrounding the League, both in the U.S. and abroad?
Well, you have someone like British statesman Robert Cecil,
Okay.
a passionate advocate for internationalism.
Yeah.
He played a crucial role in drafting the League Covenant.
Interesting. So Cecil, a British conservative, sharing Wilson's idealistic vision.
He truly believed in the power of international cooperation.
It suggests that support for the League, transcended national and even ideological boundaries.
Absolutely. The idea of a world governed by law, not force, resonated with people from diverse backgrounds and political persuasions.
Right. But of course, the League also had its detractors.
Of course.
Who were some of those who opposed it from the start?
Well, in the U.S., one of the most vocal critics was Senator William Borah,
Okay.
a staunch isolationist who argued that the League would entangle the U.S. in foreign conflicts and undermine its sovereignty.
So Bohr's arguments tap into this, deep-seated American skepticism of foreign entanglements,
Right.
something that's still present today.
It is a complex issue with deep roots in American history and identity.
Yeah, and the League's failure, at least in the short term, reinforced those isolationist tendencies in the U.S.
It did. But, as we'll discuss, World War II ultimately forced a reassessment of that stance.
Okay.
The devastating consequences of inaction and the rise of fascism ultimately pushed the U.S. towards a more active role
Okay.
on the world stage.
So the League may have failed, but it wasn't all for nothing.
Not at all.
It laid the groundwork for this new kind of international cooperation, one that would eventually lead to the creation of the United Nations.
Right. It was a stepping stone in a way.
Yeah, a flawed experiment, but a crucial one.
I think that's a good way to put it. The League's failures, however tragic, offered valuable lessons about what works and what doesn't in international relations.
Okay, so the League, born out of this idealistic vision, faced a lot of challenges and ultimately crumbled. But before we jump to the legacy of the League and its connection to the UN, I'm kind of curious to dig a little deeper into some specific examples of where the League struggled.
Sure.
What were some of the key crises that tested the League's ability to maintain peace?
Well, one striking example is the Manchurian crisis in 1931.
Okay.
Japan, a member of the League, invaded Manchuria, a region in northeastern China.
Wow. So Japan, a member of the League that's supposed to be all about peace and collective security,
Right.
just decides to invade another country.
It was a blatant act of aggression.
That seems pretty bold even for the time.
Japan was seeking to expand its empire,
Right.
and they used a staged incident as a pretext for the invasion. The League condemned the invasion.
Okay.
They sent a commission to investigate, but Japan simply withdrew from the League in 1933, facing no real consequences.
So much for collective security, right?
It seemed that way.
It seems like when push came to shove, the League was powerless to stop a determined aggressor.
In this case, yes. The League lacked a standing army and relied on its member states to enforce its decision.
Right.
So when a powerful country like Japan decided to go rogue, there was little the League could do.
It's interesting you mentioned the lack of a standing army.
Yeah.
Was that a fatal flaw in the League's design?
It certainly limited the League's ability to act decisively.
Right.
The reliance on member states to voluntarily contribute troops meant that action often depended on the self-interest of individual countries rather than a shared commitment to collective security.
Right. And it seems like the absence of the U.S. also played a role.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if the strongest nation in the world isn't part of the club, it's going to embolden those who want to break the rules.
Right. The U.S., with its economic and military might, could have played a decisive role in deterring aggression.
Yeah.
Its absence left a void that revisionist powers like Japan were all too eager to exploit.
So the League hampered by both structural weaknesses and political realities.
It was a combination of factors.
Did it have any successes at all?
It wasn't a complete failure. It did achieve some notable successes, particularly in areas like resolving territorial disputes, facilitating refugee resettlement, and promoting international cooperation on public health issues.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Not at all.
There were glimmers of hope moments where the League actually made a positive difference in the world.
Yes, and those successes, though, often overshadowed by the League's more prominent failures, demonstrate the potential of international cooperation to address shared challenges.
It's just tragic that it couldn't ultimately prevent another world war.
It is a tragedy.
That failure, I imagine, will always overshadow any of its achievements.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
The inability to prevent World War II will forever be the League's most significant and enduring legacy.
Right.
It serves as a reminder of the fragility of peace and the challenges of building a lasting international order.
Sounds like there are some important lessons to be learned from the League's failures.
Def-
Lessons that would be crucial in shaping the United Nations and its approach to global peace and security. You know, it feels like the League of Nations is one of those historical events that really forces you to grapple with these big questions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like what causes war?
Yeah.
Can international cooperation truly work?
Right.
How do you balance, national interests with global responsibilities?
Those are exactly the questions that the League's founders were wrestling with.
Yeah.
And, those questions are just as relevant today
Right.
as they were a century ago.
It's amazing how these events from the past can still feel so timely,
Yeah.
so connected to the challenges that we face, in the 21st century.
It speaks to the enduring nature of these fundamental questions about human nature,
Right.
power,
Mm-hmm.
and, the quest for peace.
And our deep dive into the League of Nations, I think, has really highlighted those connections.
I think so.
We've seen how the League, this organization born out of idealism,
Yeah.
and this desire to prevent another world war ultimately struggled to live up to its own lofty goals.
Right. It's a story of both, aspirations and limitations.
Yeah, we've explored its successes and failures, the personalities that shaped it, the events that tested its limits.
Right. We've delved into that complex interplay of idealism and realpolitik.
Yes.
The challenges of collective security.
Right.
And that constant tension between national interests and global responsibilities.
And it's been quite a journey, and I feel like we've uncovered some valuable insights.
I agree.
But I'm also left with this sense of, I don't know, unfinished business.
Yeah, I understand that feeling.
Like we've only scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn, of course.
Yeah.
But I think we've laid a solid foundation, for understanding the League of Nations, its significance, and its enduring relevance.
And it's clear that the League, despite its ultimate failure, had a profound impact on the course of history.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it laid the groundwork for the creation of the United Nations.
Yeah.
It shaped the way we think about international cooperation today.
It's a direct lineage, from the League to the UN.
And the UN, though, flawed in its own ways, learned from the League's mistakes.
Right. They incorporated a more robust mechanism for enforcing its decisions.
Yeah, like with the Security Council and that veto power.
Exactly. And they recognized the importance of including all major powers, particularly the United States.
That was a key difference, wasn't it? The U.S. playing a central role in shaping the UN from the very beginning.
A crucial difference the U.S., after experiencing the devastating consequences of World War II and the failure of isolationism, really embraced its role as a leader
Right.
in the post-war world.
So the League's failure, in a way, paved the way for this more effective and lasting form of international cooperation.
It's kind of a paradoxical outcome.
But as you said, the UN has its own flaws and faces its own set of challenges in the 21st century.
Right. The world has changed dramatically since the UN's founding.
Yeah.
We're seeing a shift in global power dynamics, the rise of China, India, other emerging economies.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenges we face are also increasingly complex and interconnected.
Right.
From climate change to nuclear proliferation to global pandemics.
Yeah, it seems like the UN needs to adapt to this new reality, just as the League struggled to adapt to the changing world, of the interwar period.
Adaptation is key.
But what does that adaptation look like?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Some argue for reforming the UN Security Council to better reflect the current distribution of power.
Okay.
Others emphasize the need for more effective mechanisms for addressing these transnational challenges like climate change.
So we need a new way of thinking about global governance.
Yeah, I think so.
One that moves beyond these traditional notions of national sovereignty and embraces a more collaborative, interconnected approach.
Perhaps that's the most important lesson we can glean from the League of Nations.
Okay.
The interconnectedness of our world, the shared challenges we face.
Yeah.
They demand this new level of global cooperation and solidarity.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the League of Nations, I want to leave our listener with this thought.
Okay.
The League may have been this flawed experiment,
Yeah,
but it was a bold and ambitious one.
it was.
It was a testament to the human desire for peace and the belief that we can build a better world together.
Right.
And even though it ultimately failed, its legacy lives on
It does.
in the institutions and ideas that continue to shape our world today.
And the League reminds us that the pursuit of peace is a continuous process, not a destination.
Right.
It requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes.
And most importantly, it requires a belief in the possibility of progress,
I agree.
a faith in our ability to overcome the challenges that divide us, and a shared commitment to building a future where peace prevails.
A future where cooperation, not conflict, defines our shared destiny.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful,
Yeah.
thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of human ingenuity to create a better world.